Hello and welcome to the Scientist.com Supplier Virtual Training Series. Today's webinar, the last in a four-part series, will focus on filling orders efficiently. Just a few reminders before we begin the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants and attendees within 48 hours after the event. As we all continue to work from home due to the pandemic, we hope you'll understand if you run into any technical issues or hear background noise from the speakers. We appreciate your patience and your involvement. If you have any questions during the presentation, please ask them by using the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom window with the large letters Q&A. Our panelists will answer submitted questions at the end of the presentation, and when the event finishes, we'd appreciate if you could fill out a brief survey regarding the experience. We'll provide more information about that after the event. First, I'll give you a brief introduction before our experts walk you through a number of topics, such as best practices for submitting proposals, how to submit invoices, unique cases, as well as our SciPay functionality. Hi, my name is Sean Precy. I'm Scientist.com's Director of Communications. I've been with the company for nearly 4 years and I oversee all aspects of company-related communications and content. Our panel includes Andrew Nashid, Senior Director of Supplier Relations, and Dan Drobnicki, Director of Finance. Andrew's the Senior Director of Supplier Relations, who's been with the company for almost 7 years. As one of the earliest full-time employees at Scientist.com, Andrew helped to build a supplier network by assisting in all phases of the onboarding process. In his current role, Andrew focuses mainly on maintaining relationships with suppliers on our platform, sharing new opportunities with them, as well as helping them to grow their market share. During today's webinar, he'll be sharing key steps of the proposal submission and invoicing process. He'll be followed by Dan Drobnicki. Dan is the Director of Finance at Scientist.com, where he oversees the day-to-day functions of the accounting and finance team, from receiving invoices to payments for completed orders. Dan has been with the company for over 4 years, and when he's not at work, you'll find him hiking or surfing. Before I turn it over to Andrew, I'd like to remind everyone to please type in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as you think of them, and we'll strive to answer as many as possible. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is the fourth and final in a four-part series. In previous webinars, we covered a general overview of being a supplier on Scientist.com, how to build your profile, and what marketing options are available. Today, we will be taking a close look at the steps involved in accepting and invoicing an order. If you have questions about the other topics, you can access the recordings of all the webinars in back office, or you can contact us directly at either of those email addresses. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Sean. As Sean mentioned, today I'll be walking you through a number of different topics. We're actually going to start on the submitting proposal side of things. So I'm going to be walking you through some key steps when you're submitting a proposal, as well as some unique cases. We'll also go through a live example of how to submit a proposal on the system, so you know every single step that is involved when submitting that proposal. So the first thing I just wanted to mention as a key tip, when suppliers ask what's the most important thing when submitting a new proposal, the most important thing really is to ensure that you include as much detail as possible. Scientist.com is a marketplace, so obviously there are a lot of different suppliers, and oftentimes there could be multiple suppliers on each request. So when a client is comparing proposals, looking for which supplier they should move forward with, oftentimes the supplier that includes the most detail, the supplier that shows that they really have an interest in working with them on that project, and the supplier that truly displays their expertise on that project, oftentimes is the one selected. Additionally, if there are milestones on a project, and we'll go through this in just a moment in the live example, but if there are milestones on a project, it is important to include those. That is important not only for the client to be able to see the different steps that would take place in the study that you are running for them, as well as the different samples or whatever else you are sending to the client, but it's also important for the invoicing process. So if you were planning on invoicing at different points throughout the study, or you were planning on invoicing different pieces of the work throughout the study as well, it is really important to make sure that those are included as milestones as well. And finally, I wanted to note as well with regards to shipping costs, if there are any shipping costs included in the particular order for the proposal that you are submitting, it is important to include those as well. We know that shipping can be an estimated cost many times, but even just including it helps the process to go as smoothly as possible so the client understands that there is that shipping cost. When you go into the actual proposal submission process, you will have to select how the transaction fee is assigned. Every request on Scientist.com contains a transaction fee. It's a low percentage fee that has to be paid on each request that is processed through the system, and it is done by percentage. As the supplier, you have the ability to choose who would cover that transaction fee. You can choose that the customer would pay that transaction fee. You can choose that your own organization would cover the transaction fee, or you can actually split it with the client. This is completely up to the supplier who's submitting the proposal. My general recommendation is that oftentimes suppliers who have not worked with a client in the past, maybe they're trying to get to be able to work with that client, they're trying to build a new relationship. Oftentimes suppliers in that case would choose to cover the transaction fee themselves or split it. Or in some cases where their margins are very low, where they actually are unable to absorb the fee, they may choose to pass it along onto the client. But again, it's completely up to you as the supplier what occurs with that transaction fee. However, when submitting a proposal, the most important thing to remember is that the net price will be the amount that you receive. Once we go into the system, once again, I'll show you exactly how that works. But it's important to remember that this net price, no matter if you choose the customer pays, whether you choose to split the fee or whether you choose to cover it yourself, that net price is the amount that you're going to see on the PO and the amount that you will then be able to invoice for. And finally, one note before we jump to the system is that work should not be started until a client actually accepts an SOW and a purchase order is issued. We know that purchase orders oftentimes can take a day or so to actually be issued, but it is really important to make sure that you actually have that purchase order in place before the work begins. The reason being is because once the client has a purchase order in place, they are then legally obligated to work with you for that particular project. Payment can be processed and all those different details. Now, before we jump into the system, one minor note just regarding taxes. Tax is always predicated on the transaction with scientist.com, which is an organization based in California and registered in a few different countries for VAT and not with the underlying customer. So there may be different things that occur with the taxes, but it is important just to ensure that the tax is always predicated on that as well. Now at this point, I'd like to go into the system itself just to show you a live example of how the system works. So this is a test request that I have open here. This test request is very similar to any request that you would receive on scientist.com. So as I scroll down the page, you'll see I have all the details from the client included here. If I scroll down a little bit further, you'll also see I have all the payment terms listed. I have the scientist.com transaction fee, and I have the full shipping address of the client. We go back up to the top of the page and I go to the timeline tab. On this page here, you'll have all the details regarding the client's request. You can see below that I asked a few questions to the client and they provided those answers. As you may have seen in previous demonstrations, you can respond further to a request by declining it, by clicking this decline button. You can also send additional messages to the client if you needed any additional information. But really the purpose of today is to go over the proposal submission process. So I'm going to click the green button to submit a proposal. As was mentioned, as we come to this page, it will be a completely new page where you enter the details of your proposal. The first thing you have to select is the proposal type, and you have a choice between an estimate and an SOW. If I click on either of these, you'll see the form does not change. The only difference being is that an estimate is a non-purchasable proposal. So if, for example, you received a project and you know it may cost around $10,000, you can select estimate, and that will give the client a rough idea of what the study will cost, but they won't be able to move forward with your proposal. However, if you wanted to submit a purchasable proposal, you can select SOW. The client can still come back to you, ask you any questions, or ask you to modify the proposal in some way. However, they could also simply just accept it and move forward with that particular proposal. Below that, you will select the tax category, whether it is a provision of service, good or product, human sample, or human blood. I will just keep it as service for now. As was mentioned too, you do have a free text box where you can enter in any additional notes. So this is really important. Going back to that point previously about including additional information, it's always good to include it on the actual request form because the client will be able to see that right away as well. You can also upload any supplemental files by clicking this Add Files button. It is important to note as well, we do recommend to not include pricing information in the supplemental files. The only reason being is because just due to the transaction fee, it's important to make sure that the prices line up. So if you are going to include any pricing in a supplemental file, just make sure that that pricing lines up with the pricing that the client is going to see. And below that is where we have come to the pricing section of the proposal submission process. You can select different currencies of US dollars, euros, British pounds, or a few other currencies you can see here. We'll just keep it as US dollars for now. I can select the fee assignment. So we'll select customer pays for now, and then we can modify that in a moment. And then below that, I would enter in my line items or milestones. So in this case, we'll say that we have 3 milestones for this particular project. We'll say we have milestone 1, milestone 2, and milestone 3. We'll keep it very simple. I can change the quantity of each as necessary. So I can modify that here, but we'll keep it all as 1. And I would enter in a base price for each milestone. So we'll put that each milestone is $1,000. From that, after I've entered in the base price, you'll see my net price now remains $1,000 because I have the customer actually covering the transaction fee. So what would occur in this case, because the transaction fee is 5%, is that the client would actually see the base price of each milestone as $1,050. They would pay scientist.com that amount. We would take out our fee and pay you that $1,000. Additionally, you can also select the supplier pays, and you'll see your price then drops to $950. Again, in this case, the client would see the price as $1,000 per milestone. They would pay scientist.com that amount. We take out our fee and pay that $950. And you can also choose to split it. And in that case, your price would drop to $975 per milestone. Once again, the really important thing, though, is just to remember that the net price is the amount that your organization will be paid. So it's really important to make sure that that is the amount you intend to be paid. Below that, you have a box for shipping and handling costs and tax costs. There are no fees taken out of those, so those are entered in as separate boxes. And again, it's important to remember that taxes are still predicated on the fact that scientist.com is a company based in the US and California. And the shipping and handling costs we know can be estimated as well, or you can select that there is no shipping cost. Below that, you have the turnaround time or the estimated time range for the completion of that project. You can enter that in of units of days, weeks, hours, or months. One of the really important things to note here is that clients oftentimes very much focus on this turnaround time. We found that clients are obviously always looking for a supplier that is interested to work with them, but other factors that also impact their decision can include things like cost, or even turnaround time is oftentimes very important. So it's important to make sure that you include a turnaround time that is accurate and gives the client a good idea of how long the study will take. Below that, you will select your shipping and billing address. I'll show you how to add those into your profile in just a few moments. You can enter in an expiration date for the proposal or select that it does not expire. And then down at the bottom of the page, you would click the orange button to proceed to the proposal summary. Once we get to this new page here, you'll be able to review all the information you have just entered. So I can make sure that all the pricing details I've entered in are correct. I can make sure any files I have attached. I can make sure that all the notes that I have entered as well. If I would like to edit anything, I can click the orange button to go back and edit my proposal. I can save it for later if I'd like someone else to work on it, or I'd like someone else to make any modifications. I can cancel if I'd like to completely start over. But in this case, because I'm ready to submit my proposal to the client, I will click the green button to submit my proposal. Once I click that, you'll see as soon as this page loads, my proposal will be submitted. And if I go back to the request, my status has now changed from vendor review to SOW submitted. So at this point, the client has received a notification that they have a new proposal, and they'll be able to access my proposal in the system and review it and choose to move forward with me or whomever else they would like. So back on the presentation, I'd like to move forward with 2 unique cases that often come up when submitting proposals. And that is around standing orders and legal obligations. Standing orders we often define as really a set number of projects over a fixed period of time, or it's a set dollar amount over a period of time. So for example, if you wanted to have a set number of projects over a set period of time, let's say 20 units at $200 each, you would simply enter that in so that the client can accept that proposal for that larger amount, and they'll be able to simply you'll be able to simply invoice against that purchase order every time the client makes an order. And if you have many different services under one order, then you actually would simply just reverse the units in the price. So for example, if the client wanted a $1,000 standing order, you would actually enter in 1,000 units, or the quantity of 1,000 at $1 a piece. And I'll go into an example of that in just a moment. But one other unique case I did want to mention is legal obligations. So legal obligations are actually additional terms to the research services agreement that you would like to add. You cannot include additional legal obligations in any attachments or in the description section. Those are not legally binding. There is a specific place that you would need to enter those in. The reason for that is because as soon as you enter them into that specific box, they do become legally binding, and it actually triggers a review on the client side. I'm going to go over the process very quickly, but I would recommend if you do have any questions on legal obligations, if you do plan on adding them to your organization's proposals, please reach out to our team before doing so. We can make sure that everything is set up in the proper way, and that if they are absolutely necessary, that the client can accept them without any delays. So just to quickly jump back into the system, if I go back to my proposal here and I go to submit a new proposal, let's say for a standing order, as was mentioned before, you do everything exactly the same. So the proposal type and everything like that is exactly the same. But in this case, we're going to say we only have one milestone, and this will be my standing order. So in the first case, as was mentioned, you may have a quantity of 200 units and a base price of 100. So what would happen in this case is the client would actually accept my proposal, and we'll make it very simple and say that the customer is paying the transaction fee. But in this case, the client would accept my proposal and issue a purchase order. What would then happen is over a set period of time, if they wanted to simply invoice against this, they can do so. So as they continue to run tests or continue to purchase units from my organization, I would simply just invoice against this standing order until the funds ran out. The only other note I would make, as was mentioned before, is if you do have a set quantity that they would like to purchase. So let's say they wanted to purchase $200,000 worth of services from your organization, maybe over a whole year. You would simply enter in a quantity of 200,000 with a base price of 1 so that the client can then accept that. And then what would happen in that case is if the client proceeded with some work with your organization for $1,000, you could simply invoice against that 200,000. But the next month they do, let's say $5,000, you could very easily invoice against that again as well. So those are the two different cases. Once again, though, if you do have questions on a specific request, you can always reach out to our team for more information as well. And additionally, the other unique case that we mentioned was the additional legal obligations. And that is actually included down here. So once you come to the bottom of the page, there is a box that you see here to click here to include additional terms, restrictions, or amendments to agreement. When I click on this box, you'll see a box now appears where I would enter in the details of the changes that I would like to make. If you would like to make any changes to the research services agreement, you would need to call out the specific clause you would like to modify. So we'll just say clause 5F is modified as follows, and then I would simply outline the modification I wish to make here. Once again, if you do plan on making any changes, please reach out to our team before, because once you do actually enter in these changes into the system, it actually triggers a review on both the client and the scientist.com side. This can lead to delays if this is not done correctly, so it's really important to make sure that if you absolutely need to add additional terms or restrictions to the agreement, that you do so in the proper way. Back in the presentation, I'd like to go over the process now for submitting invoices. What would happen after you submit your proposal and all that detail we just went through, the client can now review and accept your proposal. Once they accept your proposal, you would actually receive an email with the scientist.com PO. So again, the work should not start until you actually receive that PO from scientist.com. The PO will be contained in that email as a PDF, but you can always access it in the system as well. Once you receive that PO, the work would then begin directly with the client, and you have the ability to then invoice scientist.com. The key distinction I would make here, though, is that any results, data, samples, or anything else associated with that request would be sent directly to the client. So you're never sending any samples or anything like that to scientist.com. You're never sending any results to scientist.com. All of that is sent directly to the client. And when you are going to submit an invoice, before you do so, it is important to also check in your back office profile under the legal entity section to make sure that your banking and vendor details are correct. And I'll show you where that is in just a moment as well. But one other note just to make is when you are ready to invoice for a project, invoices should always be submitted to invoices@scientist.com. If you do send an invoice directly to the client, this can cause a lot of confusion on both the client and scientist.com side just to make sure that payment is processed to you as smoothly as possible. So whenever you receive a purchase order from scientist.com, it's just really important to remember that the invoice must always be submitted to scientist.com. It is always also important to include the PO number in the invoice or the email that you are submitting to invoices@scientist.com, just to make sure that we can very quickly process this invoice. And if you do ever have a question regarding an invoice or need any additional assistance on invoicing, you can always reach out to our finance team at finance.helpdesk@scientist.com. As was mentioned, I did want to very quickly show you how you can actually review your banking details and actually upload them on scientist.com. So if we go over to this page here, the way I would actually get to this is by clicking on company profile on the top of my page. There are two tabs I wanted to highlight for you today. That is the location section first. This is where you can add in different locations like billing addresses or shipping addresses. You can add those all in here. And you can also go to the legal entities tab. And this is the most important area to make sure that is uploaded before you submit an invoice to scientist.com. If I click here to create a new legal entity, I would enter in my legal entity name. I would select my billing address from the addresses that we just entered in the locations. I would enter in tax ID and DUNS number, as well as a tax form. Below that, I do have a section for the banking details. This again is very important to make sure that we can make payments to your organization, and you can also enter in the accounting contact information for that particular location as well. So it is really important to make sure all of that is uploaded into the system to ensure that payment can be made to your company. And one other minor note I did want to make, as was mentioned before, once you do receive a PO for a project, it will be emailed to you as a PDF, and you can always access it in the system. Any project that has a PO associated with it would be changed to the status of work in progress. This work in progress request, you can see now has a purchase order listed. I can click on the PO number to actually view the PO in the system. As was noted before, the bill to will always be listed as scientist.com. Ship to will always be directly to the client, and the ship from will be your address for the supplier address. Below that, you'll have all the pricing details as you would on any normal PO, as well as the next steps for invoicing to scientist.com. Back into the system, now that you have received the proposal, now that you have invoiced for that project, I wanted to highlight two unique cases as well. The first one is actually amendments. So if a project goes beyond the amount on a PO, you'll actually need to issue an amendment to the client. This is an additional proposal that you are submitting to the client for only the additional work. This is really important to note because oftentimes projects go beyond the exceeded value that was issued on the original purchase order, but you won't be able to invoice for anything additional until you actually have a new purchase order from the client issued. So for example, if you had a project that cost $10,000 and for whatever reason, the client chose to do additional work or the study went beyond that original cost of $10,000, you would need to add in an amendment for the additional work. Let's say it's $2,000 so that you could then invoice for that additional $2,000. Clients do need to approve an amendment. So if you do suspect an amendment is coming or you do have an amendment that needs to be issued, it is important to do it as early as possible. I'll show you in just a moment how amendments can be added to a proposal, but it's really important to, again, make sure that if an amendment is needed, it is included before the work is done. Finally, I wanted to note with regards to ratings, once a project is completed, clients are then prompted to rate your organization. These ratings are displayed on our system, so clients can actually see those ratings on your profile, and they'll be able to see if you have 5 stars for the work that you have done with that particular client. And additionally, it does help for your organization to become more visible on our system. So we do recommend that after a project is completed, you can always reach out to the client directly to ask them to rate your organization as well. So very quickly, just to go back into the system to note with regards to amendments, once again, on this particular project, I already have a purchase order. If I would like to submit an amendment for this project because it has gone beyond the net total right here, I have invoiced for all of this, or I recognize that we're actually going to add on additional work, or the client would like to add on additional work. What I would do is next to the purchase order, I do have this actions button. If I click on this, The second tab listed here is the Create Amendment tab. If I click on that, I'm taken to a page that looks exactly the same as the proposal page that we had earlier. The only difference being is now the proposal type is automatically selected as amendment. Below that, I have all the similar boxes that I have before. I have everything exactly the same with the currency, the fee assignment, even the line items / milestones. The only note I would make here is that when you are uploading an amendment, you are only uploading a proposal for the additional work. So you're not including the original work that was done. This is only going to be for the additional work. So in that case I gave earlier, where we had a purchase order already for $10,000, but we needed an additional $2,000, what I would do in this case is actually add in the additional line item for $2,000. Everything else is exactly the same on the proposal side of things. So the shipping and handling costs and tax costs, even turnaround time, billing addresses, everything else is the same. You would simply go through that same process to submit that to the client so that they can then accept that additional work that is needed and continue to work with your organization, and you will be able to invoice for that additional project. So that is really all that I wanted to go over in terms of submitting proposals and submitting invoices on scientist.com. We'll be taking questions, as was mentioned, at the end of the presentation. So if you do have any, please just feel free to ask them in that Q&A box. But one last thing before we get to the Q&A portion of the presentation is we'd like to take you through our SciPay process. So SciPay is actually our supply chain financing tool, which allows for you to be paid more quickly than the standard payment terms on scientist.com. Standard payment terms across scientist.com are 75 days. So any project that you receive from any client will have payment terms of 75 days. However, we recognize that oftentimes suppliers may need faster payment terms. You maybe need to be paid in 15 days or 30 days or even 60 days or 45 days. So our supply chain financing option, SciPay, actually gives you the ability to receive payment faster for a small percentage of the particular invoice. The major benefits of SciPay include early payment. Obviously, as was noted before, if you'd like to be paid more quickly than the standard 75 days, you can actually request early payment through this SciPay program, depending on the rate that you would choose, whether you choose 15 days, 30 days, 45 days, or 60 days. That will vary the percentage of the invoice that will be taken. However, you can receive funds in as little as 15 days. Additionally, a really nice benefit of SciPay is that you also receive invoice management. This is through our SciPay tool. You would actually receive a dashboard that contains all the invoices that you have submitted on scientist.com. This would contain the status of each of those invoices, when they were submitted, what the payment date is. This would also tell you if the client has approved the invoice and what the status is when that will be paid. One other key benefit of SciPay is that you also receive auto approval of any invoice under a certain dollar amount. So normally what happens on scientist.com is once you submit an invoice through the system, we do need approval from the client before we can pay your organization, just to make sure that everything has been completed as stated in that invoice. And so we can make sure that the client is satisfied with the work as well before the supplier is paid. However, with SciPay, we actually auto-approve invoices under a certain dollar amount. Again, depending on the rate that you choose, that would actually set the auto-approval rate as well. So there's no need to wait for any client approvals as well when you do sign up for SciPay. And finally, one of the major benefits of SciPay is that it is a very easy sign-up process. Working with many large pharma companies, we found, and even with different banks and things like that, we found that supply chain financing options oftentimes take quite a while to sign up for. They have multiple layers of paperwork that need to be filled out. They have multiple things that need to be established before a supplier can actually be set up in their supply chain financing tool. However, SciPay, we wanted to make the process as easy as possible and open to suppliers of all sizes. So whether you are one of the largest suppliers in the world, whether you're a very small supplier, we absolutely welcome you to join our SciPay program. The way that you would do so is actually by going to scipay.scientist.com. You would be able to review the terms and conditions that are associated with SciPay. You'd be able to see the different rates that are associated with the different payment terms. But once you actually sign that agreement and send it to finance.helpdesk@scientist.com, you'll be given access to SciPay. Typically, this only takes about 2 days, so you can be set up extremely quickly. And as was mentioned, there is no back and forth process that can take quite a while. Because you are a supplier on scientist.com, you have access to the supply chain financing tool. So I'm actually going to pass it over to Sean to see if we have any questions from our audience to answer.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very informative, and thanks for the presentation, as well as the demo of the back office. I see the audience does have some questions. First up, this one's kind of interesting. How much of the rating system is based on the purchase invoicing process versus actual services rendered?
So the rating process is typically based on the actual services rendered. It typically has nothing really to do with the invoicing and submitting proposal process. The rating system is really a client actually rating your organization on the work that you completed for them. So as was mentioned, this can be done in a few different ways. You can first of all ask the client after you have completed a project with them to rate your organization, but also too, if you have worked with a client in the past and you'd like to ask them to go in and rate your organization, you can always share what we call a universal link. This is available on your organization's company profile under the marketing tab. So this is the tab that I have here. I just went to company profile, clicked on the marketing tab, and then here I have the custom profile link that I can share with any client who works with scientist.com, and they'll be able to go in at any time and rate your organization so that you can improve your presence on our system.
Thank you, Andrew. Here's one. If I'm a non-US based entity, why do I need to attach a tax document, such as a W-8 Ben-E?
Yeah, so basically we require a tax document. Well, not us in general, but the IRS needs some kind of tax document stating that you are not a legal US entity and therefore are not subject to US taxes. So if you're an EU entity or you're in Great Britain, you basically need to declare yourself to the US government that you're not a US entity.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Here's one. Can we amend the order after we have received a PO or before?
So there would be two different processes to amend an order before or after you receive a PO. So for example, if you submitted a proposal to the client and the client has not yet accepted it. So if we go back to this page here, I have this proposal already submitted. The client, though, has not done anything with it. If I would like to modify this in any way, so maybe I made a mistake, maybe the client requested that I add additional information, all I need to do in this particular case is to actually click edit and resubmit. When I click that, I'm taken to a new page where it has all the information I entered previously, but I can make whatever changes necessary. So I could change this, for example, to 1,500 instead of 1,000 or whatever it may be. And then I would just submit this as normal. This would then submit a new proposal to the client. It would actually obsolete the old one so that the client is then prompted to accept the new one rather than the old one. However, if you'd like to amend a project after a purchase order has been issued, in that case, you would have to follow that amendment process that we noted earlier. So that would be the case like this one here, where you already have a purchase order for a project, you need to amend it. You would actually click this actions button and click create amendment for this particular project. So really it depends on what stage you are in the request process. So if you have just submitted a proposal to the client, they have not yet accepted it, you are simply just editing and resubmitting your old proposal. If you would like to amend a proposal after the client has issued a purchase order, you would do so through that amendment process.
Thanks, Andrew. Hopefully that answered that question. Here's I know, probably a pretty popular one. How can I check the status of my invoice?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So basically, once you submit an invoice to scientist.com, you might be wondering, exactly what the status is of your invoice. So there's a couple ways to check. The main one is basically to email finance.helpdesk@scientist.com. Just let us know your invoice number and the PO it's associated with, and someone will reach back to you within 24 hours normally, and just provide you with the status. And it'll be like, okay, it's going to be due on X date, or we're pending approval from the client. And if we're pending approval from the client, that just means that we're working and reaching out to the researcher, the user, make sure that the research was received and that we're okay to pay that invoice. And then the other way is really, if you sign up for SciPay, that also gives you access to an invoice management tool that's powered by SciPay and Kyriba. So basically, you'll log in to a web portal that'll be scipay.scientist.com, and you'll see a list of all of your invoices, all of the orders they're associated with, and then the status of that invoice, whether it says paid or pending approval or good to be paid or approved to be paid on X date. And yeah.
All right, thank you, Dan. This next one is kind of a two-part question. What are the different rates from SciPay in relation to the amount of days that payment can be received? And what is the absolute earliest to receive payments?
I can take that one too. So our base rate kind of starts at 2.5% for 15-day payment terms. 15 days is really the earliest that we can set SciPay up to have paid an invoice. And then it kind of goes down from there, right? So it goes 15 days or 30 days or 45 days, 60 days, and then, the standard 75 days, right? And we'd like to work with you on some of those rates as well. So just if you are interested in the SciPay program, please reach out to us and we'll see what we can do.
And Andrew, would you like to add to that at all?
No, I think Dan covered everything. I think just to sum up with regards to SciPay, as was noted, the standard rate is 2.5% of each invoice, and you'll be paid in 15 days. That also includes auto approval of any invoice under $25,000. So it also has that additional benefit. And then if you did have interest in other rates or being paid a little bit more slowly, like 30 days or 45 days, just reach out to us and we can work through the rates as well.
And I think this last question kind of responds to that one or asks about that one. So just to be clear, without SciPay, when will my invoice get paid?
Yeah, so I can jump in on that too. So our standard payment terms are 75 days from invoice submission. So basically, once you submit your invoice to scientist.com, to invoices at scientist.com, you'll receive like a bounce back, right? That'll be your confirmation that your invoice was submitted. So it'll be 75 days from that date. But if it's also your first purchase or first project with scientist.com, we just want to make sure that you go into your back office profile and input your banking details, and we get them all verified and squared away. That way, when 75 days come about, you'll be able to receive your payment without any additional delays or anything as we're trying to get your banking information set up in our system.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Andrew. I don't see any further questions, so I think that's going to complete our questions for today. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Andrew and Dan, for presenting. If you have any additional questions or you'd like to get in touch with us, our information is available on this slide. This webinar was also recorded and will be available for later listening.